Good morning. Thank you all for showing up to my session. I literally thought there were going to be 10 hungover people in the session, given that many of you probably had epic nights last night. So I appreciate it. Most of you look pretty awake for having had a good time last night. So this is rapid iteration on mobile. If you're a big tweeter, you can tweet at my username, think Mariya, or you could use the hashtag for this session, which is #leanmobile. So before I start the presentation, I want to get to know you guys a little bit better. So if you have already launched a mobile product, can you please raise your hand? You have an app in the market. Wow, okay, pretty advanced crowd. Well, what about if you are thinking of launching something in the next couple of months? All right, so we still have quite a mix. We have some of you guys very experienced in mobile, having launched apps, maybe even more than one, and then some of you who are just thinking about launching apps. 7.8 billion. That is the total amount of funding raised by mobile startups in the last year. I'm sure some of you have some of this money in your pockets right now. But while mobile funding is really hot, mobile profits are not. $10,000 to $50,000. That is the typical cost of developing an iOS app. That is just the development of the iOS app, not the design, the marketing, the maintenance, that kind of thing. $4,000. That is the average revenue per app in the Apple App Store. Unfortunately, the picture on Android isn't that much better. $12,000 to $60,000 is the typical cost to develop an Android app. Android tends to be a little bit more expensive because it's a more technical platform and there's more fragmentation. How much do you think an Android app makes on average?
$10.
$1,125 is the average revenue per app in the Google Play Store. So why is it so difficult to build a sustainable mobile business? So many of you already have a mobile app out and you're already very familiar with the difficulties, but for those of you who are new to mobile, let's go over some of them. First of all, the mobile market's very fragmented. You used to be able to have one web presence and that was enough. Now you need an iPhone app, Android apps, iPad apps, maybe you even need an iWatch or an Android Wear app. So you have to maintain multiple different code bases, and you need so many more engineers to deal with this fragmentation in the market. Second problem in mobile is gated iteration. This is particularly a problem on Apple, where on web you can just continuously deploy new code, but if you're waiting for approval in the App Store, you can wait up to a month or more. Or if Apple really doesn't like you, your app may not be approved at all. Third issue with mobile development is recruiting. Everybody and their grandmother has an idea for an app. So if you have an idea for an app and you want to hire a designer or developer to take care of it, welcome to the club. Everyone wants talented mobile talent right now, and recruiting mobile talent is really difficult. Fourth challenge is design. We spent decades designing for these beautiful, huge screens, luxurious screens that people would use in the comfort and safety of their home or their office. We get to take those design paradigms and squeeze them into these itty little bitty screens. Not only is the real estate really limited on mobile, but mobile users are incredibly distracted. We're constantly using our devices on the go. We're constantly being bombarded by stimuli that has nothing to do with what we're trying to do on the app. In fact, my favorite story about mobile distraction is in the city of London, when texting first became really popular. They had so many texting-related collisions and injuries that they started padding telephone poles and lamp posts to try to minimize the damage from these texting accidents. So mobile users are distracted, and mobile input sucks. Typing on a mobile phone just is an absolutely awful experience, and you can prove this by the sheer number of autocorrect jokes that are on the internet. What are your plans for today then? Nothing beyond seeing you dead. It actually took me about an hour to find an autocorrect joke that was tame enough to put on my slides. Because as you know, autocorrect is kind of a dirty mind. So we've talked about 4 problems on mobile. It's fragmented, there's gated iteration, it's difficult to recruit talent, and the design paradigm has completely changed. But there's one other big problem, or namely 2.5 million other problems. 2.5 million is the number of apps currently in the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. How many of these 2.5 million apps do people actually use? 8. People use, on average, 8 apps on a regular basis, and some research shows that it's actually as low as 4 that we actually use on a daily or a weekly basis. So it's not a huge surprise that mobile retention sucks. It turns out that 22% of downloaded apps are opened just once. So just getting someone to download your app is not enough because you're going to lose a quarter of them right off the bat. And even if you got them to stick around for a little bit, 62% of an app's users are typically lost after 1 month. So when you read the media and you hear about all these mobile startups getting billion-dollar valuations, raising a ton of money, you might think that designing for mobile or iterating on mobile is going to be like taking the yellow brick road to a mystical land of billion-dollar valuations and eternal glory. But having worked on a number of mobile projects, I can tell you that developing on mobile feels a lot more like this, where you're in this dark, gloomy labyrinth and you don't really know where you're going. What happens when you're in a maze and you take the wrong turn? If you don't realize it right away, you may think you're going in the right direction and keep iterating really quickly until you finally hit a dead end. By the time you realize it, maybe you've run out of money. So we've all heard stories of startups that have raised 20 million, 30 million, 40 million plus pre-launch, then spent months developing an app in stealth only to launch it and find out nobody wanted it. You don't want to do that. You don't want to make wrong turns based on early false positives, end up iterating quickly in the wrong direction only to find out that you need to turn around. So that's probably why you're in this session now, Rapid Iteration on Mobile, otherwise known as how to effectively navigate through the mobile maze without blowing all of your funding and time on a product nobody uses. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Mariya Yao, and I'm the founder and creative director of Xanadu. Xanadu is a mobile agency based in San Francisco, and we partner with clients on early mobile prototyping, strategy, and execution. So I've worked on dozens of mobile projects, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some case studies from both successful and unsuccessful prototyping cases. The talk is broken into 3 sections: principles, strategy, and tactics. When people think about prototyping, a lot of times they jump to tactics. They say, oh, what are your favorite prototyping tools? Mariya, tell me how to build an app faster. It's pretty important, but if you don't have the principles and the strategy right, then sometimes your tactics don't actually become fruitful. So today we're actually going to start at the very base level, which is principles. By principles, what I mean is foundational philosophy behind what makes a good prototype. So we're going to open with this question: what is a prototype? Does somebody brave want to tell me what they think a prototype is?
Cheap.
It's cheap. What else? What is a prototype?
Experiment.
It's an experiment. What else is a prototype? Anybody else? Every single one of you knows what a prototype is, yes? A means to convince investors. All right, what else?
It's a learning tool.
A learning tool.
MVP.
What makes a prototype effective?
Answers the question you posed.
Answers the question you posed. What else? Can you tell that you've built a good prototype? Nobody has any other answers. So before I give you my answers, I'm going to review this loop, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is the build, measure, and learn loop that's been popularized by the lean startup movement, but designers have known about this forever. So basically the way it works is you come up with a hypothesis, you build a test that tries to answer your hypothesis, you measure the results, you learn, and then you build a new prototype. A common misconception is that just iterating through this loop means that you are being lean and being effective. But that's not necessarily the case. It's only the case if you've answered the right hypothesis. Let's go back to this question. What is a prototype? A prototype is a test that helps you answer a question. What makes a prototype effective? Well, it has to help you answer the right question. Because it's very easy to build prototypes and iterate very quickly that are just helping you answer the wrong questions. So you must be wondering, how can you make sure that you're asking the right question? And to illustrate this, I actually want to go through examples of asking the wrong question. So someone mentioned earlier when I asked what is a prototype, someone said MVP, minimum viable product. Is everyone familiar with this concept? Minimum viable product is a very contentious term. People often argue, well, what's minimal? I can't tell what's minimal enough. Or viable, how can you tell what's viable until it's already out there? I actually think the biggest problem with this term is the last word, product. Because when you tell somebody, hey, you need to build a minimum viable product, they almost invariably think, I need to build a minimum viable interface. When I work with startup founders to help them ideate their products, the first thing that they want to do usually is wireframe. Just want to sketch interfaces. Sometimes they took a lean UX class or something, and they were like, oh, look, I can build a paper prototype. Now, these are all very useful tools. Wireframing, building paper prototypes, very useful. But what kind of questions does interface prototyping help you answer? You can answer questions like, well, can people navigate through my interface? Do people understand what these buttons do? And can people perform basic tasks in my app? What questions does interface prototyping not help you answer? Will people come back every day? Will they become passionate evangelists? And someone said, will they pay for your value proposition? These are all important questions that ideally you should be answering with prototype number 1. So instead of minimum viable product, let's think about a different way to think about your first early prototypes. And I encourage you to think of this question: why are you building a product at all? Generally speaking, the product that you're building is going to fall into 2 categories. It's either going to solve a problem or it's going to deliver an experience. The other way to think about this is it a vitamin pill or a painkiller? So instead of thinking, what is my minimum viable product, which often encourages you to think, oh, I need to build a piece of software, oh, I need to build an interface, you want to think about what is my minimum viable experience if you're building a vitamin pill or a nice-to-have product, or what is my minimum viable value if you're trying to solve a problem. So when you're thinking about the right questions to ask, the questions should be around your experience and your value, not over what your product should look like. And to help you really discretize what is the most important experience and value, I want to introduce the concept of a core loop. A core loop is a concept from game design. Basically, it is the main set of actions that your users must take in order to make both you and make themselves and your business successful. So as an example, let's look at Farmville. Sure, you're all familiar with Farmville. None of you will admit to playing it. But for the most part, you know how it works. You start with some money, and you buy seeds. Then you grow crops, you sell the crops, and with the proceeds from the sales, you go and you buy more seeds. If you can get people addicted to this loop, they will happily spam their friends and pay you money. And you want to basically get people doing this loop as often as possible, which is why when you look at social games, most often the virtual good that is the best-selling one is something called fast grow, which basically skips the grow crops or the waiting stage and lets you sell crops immediately. Now you may be thinking, Farmville, that's overly simplistic. My product is so much more complicated. So let's look at some other examples that, at least on the surface, seem like they might be more complicated than Farmville, but actually aren't. Dropbox. When you sign up for a Dropbox account, you get some free space. You fill the space. When you run out of space, you buy some space. You get more space. When you fill the space, you buy more space. If you don't want to do this, if you don't want to buy space, you get to spam your friends. Dropbox gives you a referral program where if you refer people to Dropbox, you get free space. It's not that different than when you spam your friends saying, hey, I need you to give me a cow. Very, very similar dynamic. If you can get people addicted to this core loop, they will pay you money or they will spam their friends. And if you look at Dropbox features, they have all sorts of features that facilitate you going through this loop faster. For example, they have automatic camera import. By automatically pulling in all your photos every time you connect your phone or your camera, they're helping you fill space faster than you would otherwise. This helps you get into this loop faster. Let's look at one more example, Amazon. Amazon right now is known as being a ubiquitous e-commerce site, selling anything and everything. And people these days are very comfortable with buying things online. But when Amazon first launched, online shopping was not as comfortable for many people because they were not used to buying things sight unseen. So an important part and an important focus of Amazon's strategy early on was actually building user-generated content. Because if you're going to go buy something sight unseen on the internet, you really, really care about other people's reviews of that product. That gives you more confidence as to whether or not you should pull the trigger on this mysterious, shady-looking website. So Amazon's core loop, when you go to buy something, you search for it and you read reviews. Then you buy a product, and if you're happy or unhappy with it, you'll leave a review. Now, not everyone leaves reviews, but the most engaged users do. And it's the engagement of these power users that then powers the engagement across all other users. In the early stages, what gave Amazon an advantage was that they focused so much on user-generated content, they had a greater diversity and greater coverage of product reviews than any other e-commerce site. So when you're thinking, what's going to be my minimum viable value or my minimum viable experience? Ask yourself, what does a user need to do to make themselves and your business successful? I'm going to give you a cheat sheet. It's usually one of these four. They either need to return regularly, contribute content, invite friends, or make repeat purchases. Generally speaking, your minimum viable value, minimum viable experience, and your core loop is going to fall into one of these categories. So again, instead of thinking MVP or product, which gets you thinking about building software, I encourage you to really discretize your minimum viable experience and your minimum viable value. And you're going to do that by answering these three questions. What is the right core loop? Again, the core loop is the set of actions a user must take to make both themselves and your business successful. Are people willing to go through it? And how often are they willing to do it? So that sums up the principles section of this talk. And the summary here is, what makes a good prototype? A prototype has to answer the right questions. Most prototypes I see answer the wrong questions. So that's step number one. Are you asking the right question? Number two, when you think minimum viable product, you're often encouraged to think about a piece of software. And you think, oh, I'm just going to do a stripped down piece of software. But what you should be focusing on is what is the minimum experience and what is the minimum value I'm trying to deliver. And then finally, every single prototype you build, from your earliest one, should be testing your core loop. That complete loop needs to be tested by the earliest prototype, because that helps you answer the right questions. So the next section, I want to talk about strategy. By strategy, what I mean is what you should focus on based on your app, your competitive landscape, and your business goals. So we're going to kind of talk about 4 different prototyping focuses, so we're going to talk about prototyping simplicity, prototyping emotion, prototyping engagement, and prototyping distribution. These are not the only strategies. Of course, there are many others, but these are 4 of the more interesting case studies that I think provide learning value. So the first one we're going to cover is prototyping simplicity. And by that I mean, how can you capture a complex experience simply on a mobile device? This is the first single-screen prototype of a very successful app. Does anyone have any guesses as to what this app does? Sorry, what was that?
Angry Birds.
Angry Birds? Anyone else have any ideas what this app does?
Looks like some kind of music.
Looks like some kind of music thing. Anyone have any other ideas? What was that? Guitar Hero. Huh, okay. So I usually get really weird answers like, oh, it's like a finance app, or it's a music app, or some kind of stats app. So the guy who said Guitar Hero, you're the closest. This is actually the first single-screen prototype of Smule's guitar app. If you haven't heard of Smule, they're one of the most successful makers of music apps. And they've made things like Ocarina, Magic Piano, Sing, and of course, guitar. So when Smule went to launch this guitar app, there were already dozens of guitar apps in the App Store. And they mostly look like this. Now, if I showed you this, you would have immediately said, yes, this is a guitar app. Why? Because it took the interface of a guitar and it squeezed it onto a mobile screen. So while that increases recognizability, none of you are going to be confused as to what this app does. Let's actually think about the experience of using this app. First of all, if you're a beginner or you don't know how to play the guitar, you're not going to know what chords to use. You won't know which buttons to push in what order. Even if you were an experienced guitarist, these buttons are so tiny and so close together, you're probably not going to push the right ones. So when you look at most of the guitar apps in the App Store, they pretty much aren't useful unless you are a very experienced guitarist with extremely tiny hands. Same thing applies to piano apps. What happens when you take a piano interface? It's a complex musical experience, and you squeeze it onto a tiny mobile device. This is a beautiful app. It's beautiful. But when you squeeze a piano onto a mobile interface, you get 1 octave. So even if you were an experienced pianist, you couldn't do much more than play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star with this app. By contrast, this is what Smule's piano app looks like. Does it look like a piano? Not at all. It doesn't look anything like a piano, because what they've done in this app is they've abstracted away all the difficulty with all the complexity with playing the piano. You don't have to read sheet music. You don't have to know which key corresponds to which note. You don't have to play the things in correct order. What they did was they figured out part of the core interaction people think of when they play the piano is the multi-finger tapping. And so here, all you really need to do is to tap with multiple fingers along with the music, and it generates complex melodies based on your timing. So it gives people who have no piano playing experience, no music reading experience, the sense that they're playing a real piano. And so they had the same philosophy when they went to design this guitar app. The design team focused on the question, well, how can we make you feel like a real guitarist? What is the essence of playing a guitar? And they decided that when you think about the guitar, and you think about the playing of the guitar, it takes an expert to know the chords, but any beginner can strum. And so with this single screen prototype, this prototype took 2 weeks to build, the design team focused on making sure that that strumming sensation on this prototype felt and sounded just like a real guitar. And within about 2 to 2.5 weeks, they were able to plug this single screen prototype into an amp, play it in their office, and people were unable to distinguish whether they had a real guitar or whether it was the prototype. Their focus was completely on getting that strumming sensation right, getting the sound right to correlate with the strumming sensation, not worried about the interface or the chords or reading notes. So once they mastered this for their 2.5-week prototype, they thought even more about, what are the other aspects of playing a guitar that are really unique to the guitar? How is a guitar different than, say, a harp? Well, when you think about your own experiences playing guitar, they often look a lot like this, right? Campfire songs, you're all singing together, you're jamming with your friends. Guitar specifically has a very social aspect, and it has a position in music as an accompaniment instrument, where you're often accompanying a vocalist. So that was step number 2. They figured out, well, now that we have strumming correct, and that is one of the essences of playing guitar, the other essence of playing guitar is actually the social aspect. So they took tracks from their karaoke app, and they started adding vocalists to the guitar track. They were the only app in the App Store to do this for guitars. And this was another maybe 2 to 3 weeks of prototyping. So this is what the app looks like now. Obviously, it's improved its design and its interface, but for the most part, the core essence is the same. The main thing you need to do is strum correctly, and then it adds a vocalist track to all of the music that you play to make you feel like you're actually, a guitarist helping out with a singer. Since the launch of the guitar app, I think they got over 5 million downloads in the first 3 months after launch. I'm sure they have many more million downloads now. And they had an average of a 4.5-star rating. So this is an example of, well, how do you capture a complex experience simply on mobile? The first thing most people want to do is they want to take the interface and squeeze it on mobile. And they think, oh, I'm reducing the size and squishing the interface. I'm simplifying my experience. But I would encourage you that if you're going to be creating an experience, that you really think about the essence of that experience. What is the unique interaction that happens with playing guitar or any other experience you want to deliver? So the second strategy I want to talk about is prototyping in motion. It's actually not too different than prototyping simplicity. Because if you're delivering an experience, a lot of times what helps you be successful, what gets people coming back, is the emotional engagement you have with the product. So if you're creating a vitamin pill, making sure that you test for emotional engagement as early as possible is a very important strategy, since that's going to help you determine how sticky the app is and whether or not you actually have a valuable product on your hands. So in this case, I'm going to talk about the case study of Toontastic. For those of you who don't know, Toontastic is an iPad app. It enables children to animate characters and record stories. The founders of Toontastic, they were inspired by children at play. They noticed that when you give children toys, they always tell stories. They make up characters, they make up plots, and they have this very engaging experience, but it's ephemeral. So as soon as the play session is over, the stories are lost. So they thought, wouldn't it be really cool to give children the ability to actually record and preserve the stories? So they started, like a lot of people do, with paper prototyping. So they built tons of paper prototypes. They tested single versus multiplayer. They tested all these different character selection interfaces. They tested different storytelling mechanisms. And what they found was that these paper prototypes didn't work that well. Because as lean as paper might feel, sometimes you might think, well, what's simpler than pen and paper? The problem is that they tend to be very high friction to use, and they found that they couldn't get a good signal either way, positive or negative, as to what was or wasn't working. Versus when they went to iPad and they tested various permutations, they were able to very quickly determine what was or wasn't successful. So instead, they scrapped the paper prototyping and they spent 2 weeks building a really simple single screen prototype where all you could do is it was one background, 2 characters, and a record button. You couldn't swap characters or swap scenes or anything. So they took this 2-week prototype in front of children and had them test it. And they did something very important. So they noticed over time that it took kids about 5 to 10 minutes to complete a story arc. So they started to test taking the iPad away from children in the middle of their play session. Because they figured, well, if the kids are indifferent, then they weren't very emotionally engaged. But if they show an emotional reaction, then we may have something. So it turns out that when they took the iPad away from kids prematurely, they would just start sobbing. They would get really upset. They would just cry and demand for this iPad back. And so the founders called this the quote-unquote tear test. And so I'm not telling you that to build successful prototypes, you have to make children cry. But I want you to recognize that they were able to test for emotional engagement really early on, and it was this tier test that gave them confidence that there was something emotionally engaging at the very, very core of their experience. Since launch, they've had over 8 million stories created on Toontastic. They have multiple apps now, not just the main Toontastic app, and Apple has appointed them to the App Store Hall of Fame. So the tier test has an adult version, which you might have heard of, which is this question: how would you feel if you couldn't use our product? This particular question was pioneered by Sean Ellis, one of the really well-known startup marketers. He encourages you to ask this question about your prototype as early as possible, as often as possible, in order to assess whether or not you have product market fit. For those of you who are not familiar with this question, this is the way it works. You ask your users, how would you feel if you couldn't use our product anymore? Would you be very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, not disappointed, or completely apathetic because you don't use it anymore? Sean Ellis found that you want to have at least 40% of your users be very disappointed. If your prototype makes adults cry, maybe you have $1 billion company on your hands. He found that companies that had less than this number had difficulty getting traction and finding viable business models, but companies that were able to exceed this number usually were able to find some kind of sustainable business model. Third strategy, prototyping engagement. If your monetization strategy depends on people coming back on a regular basis, you're going to want to make sure you test for engagement with your earliest prototypes. So in this case, we're going to go through the case study of Game Salad. For those of you who are not familiar, Game Salad is a platform that lets you build 2D mobile games without writing any code. So for example, you could build a Space Invaders game without writing any code, just using the Game Salad platform. It's a very powerful platform because the founder told me that somebody made the entire Legends of Zelda using Game Salad. So no excuses. If you've ever wanted to build a 2D game, it can be done, even if you can't write code. Now, building a game like The Legend of Zelda is already a complex endeavor by itself. So just imagine how complex the software is that enables you to do that. The way it works is you can drag and drop visual assets, and then you can add game logic and rules to all of the different objects and how they interact. So this is a pretty complicated interface. This kind of product would take years to build. But instead of going and launching right into this kind of product, the founding team asked themselves, well, we need to be able to test how badly people really want to tinker, specifically our target audience. How badly do they really want to tinker? So their very first prototype was deceptively simple. It consisted of one character, one button, and one variable that if you changed the variable and pushed one game, it would make the character move across screen. That was it. One character, one button, one variable. To me, this seems kind of boring. I don't know how engaged I would be with this kind of prototype. But when they took this prototype to their target audience, people who really like to tinker and create things, turns out they loved pushing this button. They would actually go and push it neurotically, like multiple times every 5 to 10 seconds, to the point where for the next version of this prototype, they actually took away the run game button and made it so that as soon as you updated the variable, the character would move. So very early on, one character, one button, one variable prototype let them answer how engaged people would be with potential future versions of their product. Since they've launched, they've had over 200,000 games made on the Game Salad platform, and of those games, 70 have been in the top 100 in the US App Store, which if you know how competitive mobile gaming is, that's quite an achievement. Last strategy I want to talk about is prototyping distribution. If you are building a social network or you're building any kind of winner-takes-all kind of marketplace product, then distribution becomes very important. And this was definitely the case of LinkedIn. Konstantin Gurek, who's one of the co-founders of LinkedIn and who was heading their marketing, loves to say, distribution is more important than product. He tells this to all the companies he advises, distribution, more important than product. And in the case of LinkedIn, this is definitely true. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar public company, but at the time, they had some challenges raising funding because they were considered to be launching in a crowded market. There were all these other products out there that were sort of peripherally or directly competitive with LinkedIn. Like for example, 6 Degrees, Spoke, and Visible Path are all business networking products. So they really focused early iteration, not so much on making the product better. In fact, the product was pretty much the same for months. It was pretty stripped down, just your profile and list of connections, not much other functionality. They really tested distribution methods and communication strategies to try to get people to use the product. So the first question they tried to answer was, do my own contacts want to connect with me on a professional networking site? Because if you're building a social network and your friends don't want to be friends with you on your social network, you have a problem. So Konstantin, Reed, and the 3 other co-founders of LinkedIn, they emailed hundreds of their own contacts asking them to join LinkedIn. And for every single person who did not join right away, Konstantin would call them up and say, hey, why didn't you join my site? And he found that the answer fell into 2 categories. Bucket 1 was people who saw the invitation, and they were like, oh yeah, I was gonna join eventually. And so for that bucket, they implemented reminders. For another bucket, they said, look, I saw your invite, it looked spammy and gross like Plaxo. And I just didn't understand the value proposition, I didn't want to join. So it became clear to them that their invite wasn't correctly communicating the value proposition. And so they thought, okay, well, LinkedIn is about connecting with your weak ties, meaning 2nd or 3rd degree connections. It's not really about connecting with your 1st degree connections. So let's see if people are willing to, for example, upload their address books if we promise them that it gives them access to their 2nd degree connections. So that was the second question they tried to answer. Are people willing to upload their Rolodexes in order to access 2nd degree connections? So to do this, they implemented an address book import and they watched how people used it. So it turns out that yes, people are very much willing to upload their address books, but not for the reasons they were hoping. They were hoping people would upload their address books and invite their connections so that they could get their connections. What people were actually doing was they were too lazy to search for their connections one by one on LinkedIn. People they knew who were on LinkedIn. So instead, they would upload their address books, which would then cross-reference with people already on LinkedIn, and then they could just very easily connect with people they already knew on LinkedIn. And there was very little incentive or very little natural willingness to invite people not on LinkedIn to join LinkedIn. And so they knew based on their previous tests that they couldn't just spam people's networks because that's what Plaxo and a lot of other competitors did, and that was considered very spammy, disingenuous, and it really didn't promote long-term growth. So instead, they really experimented with what is the right level of virality to get consistent growth yet maintain credibility. So they would try things like suggest 1 person a day that you should invite, or maybe only 2 to 3 a week, or try giving you good reasons for inviting one person versus another. And so when you look at the growth of most social networks, they grow and they hit an inflection point and then they just have hockey stick growth. But if you look at the growth of LinkedIn, it's actually been pretty consistent, even growth for years. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar company, but in the early days, they actually did very little actual product-related iteration. Most of their iteration was all about their communication and their invite flow and testing people's willingness to invite their contacts onto the platform. So to summarize, we covered 4 different kinds of strategies for focusing your early prototyping: simplicity, emotion, engagement, and distribution. If you're developing an experience and it's on mobile, we talked about how complex mobile ecosystems are, how distracted users are. A lot of times you want to make sure you focus on the essence of an experience instead of, say, copying an interface onto a mobile screen. With emotion drives a lot of stickiness. And if you're going to, again, deliver an experience rather than, say, create a painkiller, you're going to want to test for this emotional engagement as soon as possible, and there's really no excuse not to. You can apply the tier test, you can apply Sean Ellis's question about how disappointed would you feel if you could no longer use our product. Engagement. Most apps need to monetize in the long run based on user engagement, so there's really no excuse for early prototypes to consider engagement and answer important questions about how engaged users might be. And the fourth is distribution. If you have a product that's in a space that has network effects, then you don't need to worry so much about iterating on the product or the product interface, but you very much need to be worried about distribution, invite loops, and your growth. So we've covered principles, we've covered strategy, now we're going to talk about tactics. Tactics I like to separate into two categories, hustler versus hacker. I teach a longer workshop version of this talk where we go really, really in-depth on hacker prototypes. But since today I only have 50 minutes, we're going to just focus on hustler. So by hustler, what I mean is prototypes that you can build without knowing any code. This becomes important because a lot of times when you have an app idea, you either don't have engineering resources on your team or you don't have the technical ability yourself to execute on it. So having some hustler tactics up your sleeve can be very valuable for testing early value propositions. There's 4 categories I'm going to cover. Concierge prototypes, prototyping on platform, prototyping with competitors, and then creative prototypes. First one we're going to talk about is concierge prototypes, also known as Wizard of Oz prototypes. These are the prototypes where you manually backfill most of the functionality in order to deliver a particular experience or value. So go through an example. How would you prototype Instagram with no code written? Before you start prototyping anything, remember you want to know that you are testing the right core loop. So what is the core loop of Instagram? First thing you do is you see something you want to take a photo of and you take a photo. Then you add a filter to make it beautiful. You share it socially, and all of the social validation you get from sharing it socially makes you incentivized to take more photos. So how would you simulate this? You could start by finding 10 to 20 beta testers, your friends, people who are open to testing this value proposition. You can have them email you photos whenever they take one that they want beautified. You can edit them manually as you receive them, and then you can automatically upload them to their social networks by pre-authenticating with iPhoto and Facebook or using some other method. And then you can measure changes in key metrics. So you can run this for 1 to 2 weeks, and you can ask questions like, well, do users take and share more photos? Is the process of editing the photos, making them more beautiful and attractive, actually encouraging users to share and take more photos? And then do the photos that get shared through this testing actually get more likes and comments? Because those are really important for driving people through that core loop, getting people to take photos, get them filtered, share socially, going over and over. So let's go through another example. How would you prototype Foursquare or Swarm using just an SMS interface? For those of you not as familiar with Foursquare, it's basically a location-based service where you can arrive at a venue, check in, which broadcasts your location and marks that you've been there, and then you either get a financial reward like a discount or you get a social reward because it tells you which friends are nearby. So what is the core loop of Foursquare? You go to a venue, you check in, and then you get a reward. It used to be that when Foursquare first launched in New York, you could get discounts. You could get a discount off of Pinkberry, you could get a free cocktail, or you would get a social reward. Your friends would know where you were, and you could easily arrange to hang out. And getting that reward would incentivize you to then go back and check into more venues. That's the core loop of Foursquare. How would you simulate that using a texting interface? You could, again, get a beta testing group of 10 to 20 people. You could pre-designate a couple of venues that you want to work with, and you can buy gift cards to those venues. Let's say you just want to test this with Starbucks. So you buy gift cards to popular venues like Starbucks. You have testers text you or email you when they're at the venue. If you don't trust your testers, you can have them text you a photo of themselves at Starbucks to prove that they were there. And then you can go and you can add $1 to their gift card for every single visit that they make. Something else that Foursquare did was they had a concept called mayorship, where if you were the most active patron at a venue, you get extra bonuses. So if you want to simulate mayorship, you can just add extra dollar bonuses for the most active patron. So if you run this for a couple weeks, you can again ask questions like, are people visiting venues more often as a function of this service? And are they able to keep up engagement over time? One of the issues that Foursquare has is that early on, people were very excited about the badges and the discounts and the social clout of being mayor, but then very quickly they lost interest. So something about that core loop was just not enough to get people to continuously come back. And that's something that you could test with a prototype that doesn't even require any code. So something I encourage you to think about if you just want to test different mobile app ideas is that every phone has email, text, access to Google Docs. There are basic functionalities on every single phone that can be used to leverage manually made concierge MVPs. Second hustler prototype, prototyping on platforms. So we already talked about Game Salad. There's a gazillion different services out there that make it easy to build actual mobile apps. So I'm not going to go into depth into all of them because you can do that research on your own. I want to talk about one that's a little bit atypical called If This Then That. How many of you know If This Then That? For those of you who aren't as familiar, this is the way it works. It's basically a service that lets you string together functionality from different pieces of the web. So you can say, if this trigger occurs, then perform this action. For example, you can say, if I am tagged in a Facebook photo, save this to my iOS photo roll. If I leave a geofenced location, pop up the to-do list app on my screen. So how would you prototype Foursquare with if this then that? Here's one possibility. You could have geofenced locations, and you can say, if somebody enters a geofenced location, then track this in a Google spreadsheet. If the spreadsheet gets an updated row, then send me a text message saying to add money to a gift card. And then at the end of the day, send out an email to everybody participating showing the ranking for who was most active that day. You can even simulate the social sharing, right? You can say, oh, if somebody enters a certain location, automatically post to Facebook. If someone enters a certain location, automatically post to Twitter. So it's an example of being creative when you think about what are some ways I can simulate value and simulate experience without necessarily building code. And that's important because that way when you're thinking about value and experience, you're not thinking about interface. Third hustler category is prototyping with competitors. This is very similar to prototyping with platforms. Prior to Instagram, there was Hipstamatic. Hipstamatic launched beforehand, and some people would argue that it was actually better in terms of the filter quality. But there was one important core loop difference between Hipstamatic and Instagram, and it is this. Hipstamatic would let you take a photo and add filter, but they didn't streamline social sharing. Whereas Instagram, the engineering team heavily focused on compressing photos and sharing as quickly as possible, really streamlining that experience because they recognize part of what gets you through that core loop is not really just making photos beautiful. It's the fact that your friends are awed and wowed by the fact that you have this beautiful life, or you're drinking this beautiful coffee, or whatever it is you're doing on Instagram. They're so wowed by it that they like and comment more, and then you feel validated. Now you want to take more photos. That is essential to that core loop of Instagram, missing in Hipstamatic. So when you think about your own app idea, chances are there's already apps out there that do something very similar. And you want to understand very deeply where your core loop differentiates from theirs. And you can also just use their app and just figure out maybe a way to plug in. For example, maybe you want to use if this then that and say, oh, hey, if somebody takes a photo with Hipstamatic, automatically post to Facebook, and see if that will help you streamline that missing component of the core loop. Pretty easy to find competitive apps. You can go to GitHub. I recommend this because there are hackathons going on around the world every single day. A lot of people publicize their code. Chances are, if you look on GitHub, most of the times when I'm looking for something and I look on GitHub, I can find something that simulates the functionality I want and then just use that as a beginning. Or you can look at analytics platforms like App Annie to try to find apps that simulate or overlap with your app functionality. If you're just starting out, it absolutely makes sense to prototype on top or test at least other people's apps because you can test the difference between their core loop and your core loop without having to replicate the functionality. So the last section of hustler prototypes I want to talk about is creative prototypes. There's a gazillion different kinds of creative prototypes. We're going to talk about two of them. So Here's one. How would you prototype a mobile game where your character explores a rich and interesting world map? So that was a challenge that my friend Dustin Klingman had when he had a game idea. He thought, wouldn't it be interesting to build a puzzle like Tomb Raider kind of game where you are navigating through a tomb and you need to find treasure while avoiding booby traps. So this game could easily get out of control in terms of the amount of effort you want to put into prototyping or building this game. But he didn't have that many engineering resources to spare. So what his team did was they hacked Excel. So they thought, okay, well, each cell in an Excel spreadsheet is kind of like a room, right? And basically we can build a bunch of rooms and have one sheet that's the player sheet, which is the screen that the player sees, and then one sheet that's the game master sheet, which has all of the detail about whether there's a booby trap or not. And then they would just have the player manually move through their player sheet, and the game master would just manually update their sheet based on their answer key. And so they built this in less than a day, and they were able to test this for 1 to 2 weeks. And what they found was that this particular mechanic, this particular puzzle, it wasn't replayable enough for them to justify additional engineering resources to build out. So instead of spending engineering resources for 1 to 2 months trying to figure this out, they built a very creative prototype, and they were able to test that mechanic in 1 day. Here's another example. How would you prototype a children's app that features a highly interactive animated character? Some of you may have seen these kinds of apps. They're basically, you'll have a character on screen, and you can interact with the character, and the character does funny things. So this was the challenge that IDEO had when they were tasked with building Elmo's Monster Maker. So this is a screenshot of the final app. You can see it's really polished, and it requires a lot of animation, and it's definitely not an easy app to build. But instead of spending months building this and not necessarily testing engagement early on, they did something very different.
Cue music. So this is possible dance moves for Monster Maker. So music starts, and I'm the player, so I come in and I touch the monster, and he gives me a special dance move. I go and touch again, and he does a different one. And it can go for as long as I want. It has a few signature moves. And when I've had enough and I'm done dancing, I push the back button, and it pauses and the music stops. Monster Maker. Cool! Sonic! Come on, Sonic! Wow!
So basically, instead of using an animation library or generating characters on a mobile screen, they just cut out a giant mobile phone, cut out the middle, had a guy there just basically act out all the possible interactions. They would bring children into this testing ground and have them do different things just to see what kind of engagement or what kind of interactions were more or less engaging than others. This is something you can do. You can just print out and cut out in an hour and immediately start testing engagement rather than going and building an app that tries to replicate this and taking forever to get to the important questions. So to review, Hustler tactics include concierge MVPs, which are ones that you manually backfill. And when you're doing concierge MVPs on mobile specifically, remember that every phone has SMS, email, Google Docs, the internet. There are so many things you can simulate just by piecing together those pieces of functionality. Prototyping on platforms. Again, if you want to build something like The Legend of Zelda, you can use GameSala to do that without writing any code. Prototyping with competitors. Chances are there's an app out there that already does something like what you want to do. There's maybe 1 or 2 minor differences between your core loop, and you can use their existing functionality and try to complete your core loop and see if that actually makes a difference with regard to engagement. And finally, think creatively. You can hack Excel if you're trying to build a game. You can maybe simulate things manually like the IDEO team did for the Elmo's Monster Maker prototyping. So, lecture takeaways. We talked about 3 sections, 3 sort of foundational sections of effective prototyping. The first is principles, where we talked about how important it is to ask the right question. If you build a test that answers the wrong question, like, do people know what this button is, and can people navigate through to page X, then you're not necessarily going to answer the most important, most critical aspects of your prototyping. Instead of thinking MVP, whenever you tell somebody to build an MVP, they almost always think that they need to build a piece of software, they need to build some kind of interface. It's kind of misleading. Instead, encourage yourself to think about what is the core experience and what is the core value, because that's what you're ultimately trying to build in your product, is deliver an experience or deliver value. And then finally, you need to identify what your core loop is. The core loop, again, is the main set of actions your users must take in order to make both themselves and your business successful. So you want to identify your core loop, and from your very first prototypes, you need to be testing your core loop. Strategies. We talked about 4 different strategies that you could use in prototyping. Which ones you use really depends on, your app, your competitive landscape, your users. You want to keep it simple. If you're talking about vitamin pills, like nice to have kind of apps, if they're too complex, people don't want to put in the cognitive load to process them. And you also want to think about, well, how do you take a complex experience and capture it on mobile, just like the Smule team did with the essence of playing a guitar and capturing it on their mobile app, instead of just copying interfaces. Second, you want to test for emotion. If you're, again, creating an experience-oriented product that's a nice to have, not a need to have, you're gonna want emotional engagement right off the bat. Otherwise, it's gonna be difficult to get people to stick around. So you want to apply the adult version of the tier test, the how would you feel if you could no longer use our product test, as soon as possible with your earliest prototypes. Third, if your business model depends on engagement, you depend on users coming back daily or contributing content regularly, you're doing some kind of repetitive action, you want to measure engagement as soon as possible. And you don't need to build anything complex. The Game Salad team built a prototype that was 1 character, 1 button, 1 variable, and they were very quickly able to tell that their target audience loved it, even though it was such a boring prototype. Fourth is if you are in a space where you need network effects to be successful, or you really need to grow, or maybe your monetization strategy depends on volume, then distribution could potentially be more important than product, and that's where you would want to focus your early iteration. So to summarize, if you're going to prototype effectively, if you want to rapidly iterate on mobile, instead of, say, get stuck somewhere in the mobile maze, you're going to want to make sure your principles, strategy, and tactics are all lined up, and that way you can successfully launch. So thank you for listening. That is the content that I have for you today. If you have any questions, or you want to talk further, or you want maybe feedback on some of your mobile apps, you can reach out to me at thinkmariya on Twitter, or you can email me at mariya@xanadumobile.com. Thank you.